A one-room cabin. No windows worth mentioning. A dirt floor. Outside, the Kentucky wilderness stretches out cold and indifferent, and inside, a woman is dying. Her name is Nancy Hanks Lincoln. She's 34 years old. She's drinking milk from a cow that's been eating white snakeroot, a poisonous plant nobody in the family knows to fear yet, and it's killing her slowly, from the inside, over days. Her son is 9 years old. He sits with her. He watches her go. And when she's gone, there's no priest, no proper funeral, no time to grieve the way you'd want to. There's just a boy, carving wooden pegs to hold his mother's coffin together, because his family can't afford metal nails. That boy grows up to save the United States of America. If you told anyone standing in that cabin in 1818 that this barefoot, grieving child would one day stand in front of a shattered, bleeding nation and hold it together with nothing but words and will, they would have laughed you out of the county. And that's exactly why this story still hits so hard 200 years later. Because it shouldn't have happened. Nothing about Abraham Lincoln's life was supposed to lead to a marble memorial in Washington, D.C. Everything about it pointed toward obscurity, poverty, an early grave, a forgotten name. Instead, we're still saying his name. We're going to spend the next few minutes finding out why, and I promise you, even if you think you know the Lincoln story, there are pieces of this you've never heard. Stick around, because the ending of this story is more devastating, and more inspiring, than the myth they teach you in school. Let's start at the beginning. The real beginning. Not the marble, not the monument, the mud. Abraham Lincoln was born on February 12, 1809, in a one-room log cabin in Hardin County, Kentucky. His parents, Thomas and Nancy Lincoln, were poor farmers, not the romantic, hard-working pioneer poor you see in movies, but genuinely, precariously poor. Thomas Lincoln was a carpenter and farmer who never learned to read. He worked land that, thanks to Kentucky's notoriously tangled property laws, kept getting yanked out from under him through lawsuits over faulty land titles. Imagine building a life, a farm, a home, and having it ripped away because of a piece of paper filed decades earlier. It happened to the Lincolns more than once. By the time young Abraham was 7, the family had already been forced to move once, resettling in Indiana in 1816, in part because of those legal disputes and in part because Kentucky was a slave state and Thomas Lincoln, for reasons of both economics and conscience, wanted out. They crossed the Ohio River into what was then wilderness. Indiana wasn't a warm welcome. The Lincolns spent their first winter there living in what's called a half-faced camp, basically a three-sided shelter, open to the elements on one side, with a fire burning to keep out the cold. A 7-year-old boy, sleeping in something barely better than a lean-to, through an Indiana winter. 2 years later, his mother was dead. Milk sickness. Gone in days. Here's something most people don't know, Lincoln's father remarried within a year, to a widow named Sarah Bush Johnston, and this is one of the most quietly important relationships in American history that nobody talks about. Sarah brought her own children, and furniture, and books, into that hard Indiana homestead, and she treated young Abraham like her own son. She recognized something in him. While his father saw a boy who should be swinging an axe and plowing fields, which Lincoln did, for years, developing the physical strength that would later astonish people who met the 6'4", rope-muscled rail-splitter, his stepmother saw a boy who devoured books. She encouraged it. She protected his time to read, even when Thomas Lincoln grumbled that reading was a waste of a strong back. And Lincoln read anything he could get his hands on. The Bible. Aesop's Fables. Pilgrim's Progress. A biography of George Washington that, according to Lincoln's own later recollections, got water damaged while borrowed from a neighbor, and young Abraham worked off the debt by pulling corn husks for days rather than let the debt go unpaid. That's a small detail, but sit with it for a second, a boy so poor he couldn't replace a damaged book, but so principled he'd work it off rather than walk away. That tension between poverty and integrity would define his entire life. Formal schooling. Lincoln himself estimated, later in life, that all his classroom education combined added up to less than 1 year. Frontier schools back then were called blab schools, kids reciting lessons out loud simultaneously until they memorized them, and they were scattered, unreliable, and often miles away through rough country. Whatever Lincoln became, he built almost entirely himself, by candlelight, or firelight, lying on his stomach on a dirt floor with a book propped in front of him. Now, here's where the myth-making usually kicks in, and where I want to slow down, because the truth is more interesting than the legend. The legend says, poor farm boy, self-taught, becomes president. Simple, clean, inspiring. The truth is messier, and it involves years, plural, many years, of failure. In 1830, the family moved again, this time to Illinois. By 1831, 22-year-old Abraham Lincoln struck out on his own. He took a flatboat of goods down the Mississippi to New Orleans, and historians believe it was there, in that city, that he witnessed the slave trade up close for one of the first times, seeing men, women, and children sold like livestock. Whatever he felt in that moment, he carried it quietly for decades before it became policy. He settled in New Salem, Illinois, a tiny frontier village, and here's where the failures start piling up, one after another, in a sequence almost too on the nose to be true if it weren't documented history. He tried running a general store with a partner. It failed. The store went under, and Lincoln was left holding debts that took him roughly 15 years to pay off completely, debts he jokingly called his national debt. Think about that. A man in his 20s, buried under debt from a failed shop, grinding it out for 15 years, paying back every cent, because that's who he was. He ran for the Illinois state legislature in 1832, and lost. His first real attempt at public life, and the voters said no. He tried surveying and working as a postmaster to scrape by. He served briefly in the Illinois militia during the Black Hawk War, though, and Lincoln himself would later joke about this. He saw no combat, just a lot of marching and, in his own words, a good many bloody struggles with the mosquitoes. Then, in 1835, tragedy struck again. Anne Rutledge, a young woman in New Salem who some historians believe Lincoln was courting, died suddenly of typhoid fever. The extent of their romantic relationship is genuinely debated by historians. Some sources may have exaggerated it after the fact, but what's well documented is that her death devastated the young Lincoln, feeding into what people around him described as periods of deep, crushing melancholy. Lincoln struggled with what we today would likely recognize as clinical depression throughout his adult life. Friends worried about him. He once wrote to a colleague that he was the most miserable man living, and that if what he felt were distributed across the whole human family, there wouldn't be one cheerful face left on earth. This wasn't a passing sadness. This was a man carrying real, heavy darkness, while somehow still getting back up, over and over. He ran for the legislature again in 1834, and won. A small win. But watch the pattern here, because it repeats his entire life: fail, get up, small win, big fail, get up again. He taught himself law. There was no law school in his path. He borrowed books, studied on his own, and was admitted to the Illinois bar in 1836, eventually becoming a well-respected circuit lawyer, traveling from county courthouse to county courthouse across Illinois, arguing cases in front of local juries. This period mattered enormously. It's where Lincoln sharpened the plain-spoken, story-driven, folksy but devastatingly logical speaking style that would later hold the entire country's attention. In 1842, he married Mary Todd, a woman from a well-to-do Kentucky family, a match that surprised people, given the gap in their backgrounds. Their marriage was, by most accounts, a complicated one, real love and real partnership, but also real strain, especially as tragedy kept finding their family. Of their 4 sons, only one, Robert, would live to adulthood. Edward died at not quite 4 years old. Willie died at 11, in the White House itself, during the Civil War, of typhoid fever, while Lincoln was trying to hold together a nation tearing itself apart. Tad, the youngest, died at 18, 6 years after his father. Imagine carrying the weight of a civil war and burying your own children at the same time. That's not a footnote. That's the emotional floor this whole story stands on. Lincoln served one term in the U.S. House of Representatives, from 1847 to 1849, where he took an unpopular stand opposing the Mexican-American War, a position that cost him political support back home. He tried to get a political appointment afterward and was turned down. He essentially returned to Illinois, went back to lawyering, and for a while, it looked like Abraham Lincoln's political career might simply be over. A one-term congressman, mostly forgotten, practicing law in Springfield. Here's the moment worth sitting with. By the mid-1850s, Lincoln was in his mid-40s. He had failed in business. Lost elections. Buried a son. Battled depression his whole life. Had one unremarkable term in Congress and then nothing. If his story ended there, nobody would know his name today. He would be a footnote in an Illinois county record. But something was happening in America that wouldn't let him rest. The question of slavery, whether it would expand into new territories, whether the nation could survive half slave and half free, was tearing the country apart, and Lincoln, who had opposed slavery's expansion since witnessing that slave market in New Orleans decades earlier, couldn't stay quiet. In 1858, he ran for U.S. Senate against a powerful, nationally famous incumbent named Stephen Douglas. And this is where Lincoln does something remarkable. He loses the election. The Illinois legislature, which chose senators at the time, went with Douglas, but he wins the argument. The Lincoln-Douglas debates, 7 of them, held across Illinois, drew massive crowds and national newspaper coverage. Lincoln argued, with plain language and moral clarity, against the expansion of slavery, framing it not just as a political dispute but as a fundamental question of whether America could live up to its own founding words. He lost the Senate seat. But he became a national name. 2 years later, in 1860, Abraham Lincoln, the failed shopkeeper, the twice-defeated candidate, the man with barely a year of formal schooling, won the Republican nomination for President of the United States, and then won the presidency itself, against a divided opposition. And the country, quite literally, could not handle it. Before he was even inaugurated, Southern states began seceding. By the time Lincoln took the oath of office in March 1861, 7 states had already left the Union. Within weeks, the Civil War had begun. Lincoln didn't inherit a country. He inherited a country in the process of tearing itself in half, and he had to figure out, in real time, with no precedent to guide him, how to hold it together. Let's be honest about something the myth often smooths over. Lincoln was not, at the war's outset, an abolitionist in the way we sometimes imagine him. His primary stated goal, especially early on, was preserving the Union, not immediately ending slavery everywhere. He said so explicitly, in public letters, that if he could save the Union without freeing a single enslaved person, he would do it. This surprises people. It shouldn't be erased from the story, because what happened next is more powerful, not less, once you understand where he actually started. As the war ground on, brutal, bloody, and far longer than almost anyone expected, Lincoln's position evolved. On January 1, 1863, he issued the Emancipation Proclamation, declaring enslaved people in Confederate-held territory free. It's worth being precise here, because this is one of the most misunderstood documents in American history. The proclamation didn't free every enslaved person in the country immediately. It applied to Confederate states, not the border states still in the Union, and its power depended entirely on Union military victory to enforce it. But it fundamentally transformed the war's purpose, turning it explicitly into a fight against slavery itself, and it opened the door for roughly 200,000 black soldiers and sailors to serve in the Union military, a fact that turned out to be strategically decisive. Then, in 1865, Lincoln pushed the 13th Amendment to the Constitution through Congress, permanently abolishing slavery nationwide. This wasn't easy or guaranteed. It required real political maneuvering, arm-twisting, and deal-making in a divided Congress, and Lincoln spent enormous personal capital getting it passed before the war even ended, because he understood that the Emancipation Proclamation alone, as a wartime executive order, might not survive peacetime legal challenges. Through all of this, Lincoln was also, somehow, a masterful communicator. In November 1863, at the dedication of a military cemetery on the site of one of the war's bloodiest battles, he delivered the Gettysburg Address, a speech so short, roughly 2 minutes, that the photographer covering the event barely had time to set up his camera before Lincoln had already finished. 2 minutes. 270-some words. And it redefined, in real time, what the entire war was for, not just a fight to preserve a country, but a test of whether a nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal, could actually survive. I want you to sit with that phrase for a second, conceived in liberty. A man born in a dirt floor cabin, who taught himself to read by firelight, who buried his mother at 9 and his son at 11, stood up and redefined the moral purpose of the United States of America in 2 minutes, using words simple enough that a farmer or a soldier could understand every single one of them. That's not an accident. That's a lifetime of hard-won plain-spokenness, forged in general stores and courtrooms and campaign stumps, aimed at the single most important moment in the country's history. Now let's talk about the parts of this story that don't fit neatly into the hero narrative, because a real documentary doesn't hide from complexity. Lincoln issued an order in 1862 that led to the largest mass execution in American history, the hanging of 38 Dakota men in Minnesota following a violent conflict known as the Dakota War, though it's worth noting Lincoln actually reviewed the trial records personally and reduced the number of executions from over 300 down to 38, a decision that satisfied almost nobody at the time but reflected his attempt to apply some judicial scrutiny to a rushed and deeply flawed military tribunal process. Lincoln also suspended the writ of habeas corpus during the war, allowing the military to detain people, including civilians and Southern sympathizers, without normal court proceedings, a decision that remains controversial and legally debated to this day, weighed against the argument that the survival of the Union itself was at stake. And his views on race, examined honestly, evolved significantly but weren't static or simple. In earlier debates, Lincoln stated he did not believe in full social and political equality between black and white Americans, and for a period, he supported the idea of colonization, voluntarily resettling freed black Americans outside the United States, a plan that never gained traction and that Lincoln himself seemed to move away from later in the war. By the end of his life, in his final public speech, he publicly endorsed voting rights for at least some black Americans, the first time a sitting U.S. president had done so, a moment historians believe may have directly triggered his assassination, because a man in the audience that night, seething at the idea, turned to a companion and said it would be the last speech Lincoln would ever give. That man was John Wilkes Booth. On April 14, 1865, just 5 days after Confederate General Robert E. Lee surrendered at Appomattox, effectively ending the war, Lincoln and his wife went to Ford's Theater in Washington to see a play called Our American Cousin. He wanted a night off. The war was, for all practical purposes, over. The country, battered and bleeding, was still standing. And during the third act, Booth slipped into the presidential box and shot Lincoln in the back of the head at close range. Lincoln never regained consciousness. He was carried across the street to a boarding house, laid diagonally across a bed too small for his 6'4" frame, and he died the next morning, April 15, 1865, surrounded by his cabinet and closest allies. He was 56 years old. He had preserved the Union. He had ended slavery in the United States. And he did not live to see a single day of the peace he'd spent 4 years fighting to secure. Here's a detail that gets lost in the tragedy: Lincoln had, by most accounts from people close to him, seemed lighter in his final days, telling friends and even his wife about dreams for reconstruction, about rebuilding a broken country with, in his words, malice toward none, with charity for all, a phrase from his second inaugural address just weeks earlier. He was already imagining a gentler America, a healed one. He never got to build it. So what do we actually do with a life like this? We could talk about the statistics, the 16th president, the 16 documented job failures and defeats before the presidency, the 272-word speech that's now etched in marble, the fact that he remains one of the most written about human beings in history, with more books published about Abraham Lincoln than almost any other figure outside of religious texts. Those numbers are real, and they matter. But I don't think that's actually why we're still talking about him. I think it's because Lincoln's life is proof of something we all secretly need to believe is true, that where you start doesn't have to be where you end. That a boy with a dead mother, a debt he couldn't pay, an election he couldn't win, and a mind that battled real, documented darkness his whole life, could still become the person who held a shattering nation together with nothing but conviction and the right words at the right time. Not because he was born special. Because he read every book he could borrow. Because he paid off every debt he owed. Because he lost, and lost, and lost, and kept running anyway. Because when the moment actually came, the one moment in 100 years that would decide what kind of country America was going to be, he was ready for it, not by luck, but because he had spent his entire life quietly, invisibly, becoming ready. Abraham Lincoln walked out of a half-faced camp in the Indiana wilderness and became the man who finished what the Declaration of Independence started. He is buried in Springfield, Illinois, not far from where he practiced law as a nobody, in a tomb visited by millions of people every single year, people who, whether they know all the history or not, sense that they're standing near something that matters. Something about a man who had every reason to disappear into obscurity, and instead chose, book by book, courtroom by courtroom, defeat by defeat, to become somebody the entire world would remember. That's the story. Poverty didn't write his ending. He did. If this story moved you, hit that like button and subscribe, because we're telling stories like this every single week, real history, real struggle, real people who refuse to stay small. Drop a comment and tell me which part of Lincoln's story hit you the hardest. I read every single one. And if you want more untold stories of the people who shaped history from nothing, turn on notifications, because you do not want to miss what's coming next.